Um, my name's Jeremy Griffith. I'm an Australian biologist and I'm the author of Is It to Be? Terminal Alienation or Transformation for the Human Race, which will be launched next year, but these are advanced copies. And I'm talking to someone who's a scientist who's just received this copy, his copy, or received it a little while ago. His name is Dr David Chivers. He's a primatologist at Cambridge University and a former president of the Primate Society of Great Britain. You studied gibbons and other forest primates. So do you describe yourself, David, as a primatologist or a physical anthropologist? I'm not quite sure.
No, it's difficult, isn't it? I mean, physical anthropology has changed to biological anthropology. And I mean, it's mainly primates, but I'm almost a wildlife biologist involved in ecology, behaviour and conservation, but focusing on the apes, the Asian apes.
The Asian ape. You spent many years in, I think, Southeast Asia, India, Bangladesh, Brazil. That must have been an amazing time.
Oh, it's been wonderful. I mean, my first 2 years in the Malay Peninsula were the most intensive doing my doctoral fieldwork. From 1970 to 85, I organised students in Malaysia, and I go and visit them for a few weeks each year. But then I also had students in India, Bangladesh that I went to visit, and then in South America. So, yes, I mean, I was essentially based in Cambridge, but going to the field to advise these doctoral students.
That must have been amazing. I was going
to say, sorry, we shifted to Indonesia in 1985, working in the centre of Borneo, to try and understand the role of fruit-eating animals in seed dispersal and the natural regeneration of forests. And there was a unique population of hybrid gibbons that was the main focus of our study.
Yeah, I've seen on YouTube some very funny footage of you imitating the gibbons in the forests where they make that territorial cry that's so typical of that region, and I know you're famous for it. It's very. I won't ask you to do it now, David, but it's amazing to hear you do it. People can go and look at it on YouTube. Okay, so David's familiar with my work, and he said about this book, Is It to Be, as he said previously about my work, that the sequence of discussion is so logical and sensible, providing the necessary breakthrough in this critical issue of needing to understand ourselves. So that's a wonderful endorsement, so David's both familiar with and empathetic with my work, but he has expressed concern about the extremely confronting nature of some of the concepts, and so that's what I thought would be particularly helpful for readers of my book to discuss with David. So what just to identify what it is, David emailed me the other day saying, when I mentioned your explanation for autism to my wife, she said, as do many authorities, that it is a genetic defect. That everyone is desperate to be good mothers, and so yes, we've attributed problems like autism and even ADHD, attention deficit disorder, and those sort of things which are in epidemic in our society at the moment to damaged genes and so forth, and even chemicals, and my book says that there's a deeper reason, and that's a psychological one due to humans' inability these days to adequately nurture their offspring, and that's a very confronting truth for parents. So it's just one of the examples of many ideas in my book that people find difficult to tolerate, but as Alvin Toffler in his book Future Shock wrote, he spoke of the shattering stress and disorientation that we induce in individuals by subjecting them to too much change in too short a time. And so I suggest that when he was writing that, this concept of future shock, he was anticipating a time in the future when there would be such a massive paradigm shift, such a massive breakthrough in understanding of ourselves that it would bring about a complete change in our understanding, and the old understandings would be seen through and made transparent, and the new explanation, the new understandings would be a shock, and even though they're transformative, and that's exactly what happens when understanding of the human condition, which is the deepest underlying issue in all human affairs, is finally explained. It brings a massive change. When the blinds are drawn, as it were, and the truth about ourselves is finally revealed, while that truth is dignifying and redeeming and healing or ameliorating and reconciling, it can't but help but be also revealing of all the dishonest denials that we've had to use while we lack that explanation. Plato is considered one of the greatest philosophers in history, and the centre, his most famous work is called The Republic, and the centre of the Republic is this allegory of a cave where humans, he describes as living deep underground. They're in fear of the sun outside and its representation, namely the fire, and they can only see the world in shadows, is sort of aberrations of the real world. So that's an allegory or analogy of humans living deep underground in denial of the sun, which obviously represents the truth that we can't face. And so when you bore down into that truth is that we can't face, that we haven't been able to face, is this issue of the human condition, and unable to understand why we humans have been so competitive, aggressive and selfish, when clearly the ideals are the opposite, to be cooperative, loving and selfless. We had no choice but to bury that, hide from that truth. So he described the shock it will be for the human race one day when we find sufficient knowledge to finally explain that great riddle of why we are the way we are, why we're less than ideally behaved, explain the human condition, and be able to leave the cave, that we're all going to be in shock. And he says you'll hardly be able to face the sun for a long time, because it'll be so overwhelming, the brightness of it. And that's exactly the situation that's finally emerged. Through the advances made in science, we can now finally explain, in first principle biological terms, this issue of the human condition, which is the core concept presented in all my work. And chapter 2 in my book is focused on. So, but again, it brings about future shock, this shattering stress and disorientation by subjecting humans to too much change in too short a time, too much to try and adjust to, and so it is those most difficult elements of that when the blinds are drawn and the truth's revealed, as it were, unavoidably all the lies, all our dishonesty, all our denials, all the excuses that we've been using are suddenly rendered transparent and no longer effective. So that this is sort of historically, this is Exposure Day or Truth Day or Transparency Day, or what's historically been referred to as Judgment Day, the time when. But Judgment Day is not actually a time when we'll be condemned, but a time when we'll be a time of understanding. But it nevertheless is also a time of immense transparency and it's revelation of who we really are. And while that state is defended, it's also exposed. So that's unavoidable. But it's essentially that incredibly serious problem about this time that has emerged that I want to talk to David about, and David's raised in this question that his wife raised. So just to David, if you just bear with me for a second, I'll just try to context this book a little bit. On the back cover of my book, it says, to try and explain the title of the book, Is It to Be Terminal Alienation or Transformation of the Human Race? It says, and this is a quote from Professor Harry Prosen, who is the former president of the Canadian Psychiatric Association, who's written the introduction to my book. He says, "Is it to be or not to be?" which plays on probably the most famous phrase in English literature from Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet. Is it to be or not to be? That is the question. Are we going to make it? Is the human race going to find the redeeming and transforming understanding of our good and evil afflicted human condition? Or is our species headed for terminal psychosis and alienation? Humankind is in the balance. Will it be self-destruction or self-discovery? So that's the crisis point we've arrived at. So, and then the Professor Prosen goes on to say, well, astonishing as it is, this book presents the 11th hour breakthrough biological explanation of the human condition needed for the psychological rehabilitation and maturation of the human race. It takes humanity from a state of bewilderment about the nature of human behaviour and existence to a state of profound understanding of our lives. It is a case of having got all the truth up in one go. Understanding has finally emerged to drain away all the pain, suffering, confusion and conflict from the world. This is it, the book that saves the world. So that's a very bold statement and about the importance he sees in this book. And but what I want to talk about with Dr. Chivers is that, as I said, when you draw the blinds, how confronting this new paradigm is inevitably going to be. There's this massive paradigm shift. This is the greatest paradigm shift that could happen to the human race, and it is that ultimate future shock that Alvin Toffler was anticipating would one day occur when we'd be faced with too much change. So I'm needing what want to talk to David about is with David about for everyone's benefit, for all readers of my book's benefit, is how to cope with that enormous change. And David's focused on one of the key difficult concepts that people will find difficult to accept, which is that lack of love is what causes autism. And the traditional excuse is that it's due to genetic defects, and we can obviously see that such an excuse would be very, very relieving for parents. But as a quote I mentioned in my book says, the biggest crime you can commit in society is to be a failure as a parent, and people would rather admit to being an axe murderer than being a bad father or mother. So, and that pretty well captures the problem. Parents would rather admit to being an axe murderer than a bad parent, and so we've been very insecure about this idea that nurturing or love is the reason for all the epidemic we've got in the world at the moment of attention deficit disorder and in the extreme autism, the extreme dissociation behaviour. So that's the context of what I wanted to does that all tally with you, David?
Yes, I guess so. It's just that there's a problem of wanting to be good parents, and many of them they try, they think they're being good parents, but they can't because of if there is some genetic disorder in their offspring. This is what I agree with so much of what you have said and presented, but this does sort of stick at me.
Yes. I think the best way to answer this is, if it's all right, David, for the benefit of the viewer, I need to quickly introduce the explanation of the human condition that I give in this book, and
yeah.
So if you can just bear with me, I'll explain that. I mean, historically, we've used the excuse that I should say, you know, that humans are competitive and aggressive and selfish because of our animal heritage, you know, red in tooth and claw, that we have savage animal instincts that make us fight and compete for territory and so forth. But this can't be the real cause of our device behaviour, because like descriptions of our behaviour, such as egocentric and arrogant and deluded and optimistic and pessimistic, depressed, inspired, psychotic, alienated, all recognise the involvement in our species of our unique conscious thinking mind. So there is there's a psychological dimension to our behaviour. You know, we suffer from, not from the genetic opportunism-based animal condition, but the conscious mind-based, psychologically distressed human condition. So that we are competitive because of territorial imperative is overlooks the fact that we're conscious and we suffer from a psychological condition. So it's not the real. It sustained us. It's got us off the hook, as it were. But one day we had to find the deeper psychological reason for our particular human condition, and that's what that's the key presentation, and that's been the holy grail of the whole of biology, to one day finally be able to explain us, human behaviour. Where is the divisiveness in us, our capacity for atrocities and inhumanity coming from? And so it's in chapter 2 of my book, and Professor Prosen describes chapter 2 as reading chapter 2 is a transformative experience. So what I'm going to now explain is in as simple and as quick terms as I can, the explanation, the biological explanation presented in my book for the human condition, the psychologically distressed, upset state of the human condition. Okay. What my book talks about is that humans have an original instinctive self, and then we became conscious. Other aspects, other chapters in the book talk about how we acquired our original instinctive state, and it also talks about how we became conscious. But in chapter 2, it presents this key explanation of how we became psychologically an upset species. So, I mean, in the story of Garden of Eden, it says that Adam and Eve took the fruit from the tree of knowledge, presumably meaning we became conscious. And tree of knowledge, we became conscious. And then it says we became, after that, we became sufferers of evil, which is the old term for, I suppose, for competitiveness, egocentricity, anger and alienation and so forth. And as a result of that, we were banished, thrown out of the Garden of Eden. Now, what my book says is that, yes, we did become conscious, and as a result of that, and inevitably, a clash emerged with our already established instinctive self. And that clash was unavoidable. And so it's a dignifying explanation of why we became upset, and in finding that explanation allows that upset to subside. So to try to explain the explanation as quickly as I possibly can, let's imagine, we all know that birds, for example, are instinctively orientated to a flight path. For example, storks migrate around Africa up to their summer breeding grounds on the rooftops of Europe and back again. And obviously they've acquired that perfect orientation through natural selection. Obviously the storks that were genetically inclined to fly across the Sahara all got frizzled, and so through natural selection they've acquired the perfect path to follow so that they can survive. And it's an orientation, an instinctive orientation that they've acquired. But let's imagine we were to put a fully conscious mind on the head of one of these storks, and we'll call him Adam Stork because this sort of relates to the story of Adam and Eve but has a different ending. And we jump in ultralight and we follow this stork on his annual migration north, let's say, and we want to watch what happens, how the human condition, or the equivalent of the human condition, emerges. So we're watching old Adam Stork, and he's flying along, and he's got this fully conscious thinking mind that can understand cause and effect, make sense of experience. But he's also got an instinctive self which tells him where to fly and where not to fly. So he's flapping along, and he starts thinking for himself, look, there's an apple tree down there. I think I'll go down and have a feed of apples. So why not? At this point, he has no explanation of why he shouldn't carry out experiments in understanding cause and effect. So he duly carries out this experiment and heads off towards the island. Now, obviously, his instincts, that the instinctive flight path doesn't go down to the island, so his instincts will try to pull him back on course. At that point, he's in a dilemma. Does he persevere with his search for knowledge or just obey his instincts? Now, we can see old Adam Stork sort of veer off to the left, sort of hesitate, and then fly back on course. So what's happened is he's encountered this sort of, in effect, criticism from his instincts that don't want him to, in effect, to fly to the island, and he says, oh no, I don't, I'll obey them, so he flies back. And then he flies a bit further, we see him fly back on course again, and he's still thinking, and this time he thinks, why not fly down to that other island and have a rest? I mean, there's no reason why he should or shouldn't. At this stage, he hasn't acquired any knowledge. The only way he's going to learn what are good ideas and bad ideas is to experiment in those ideas and carry out experiments in self-management. So again, he flies off course, so we see him deviate, and then we see him hesitate because his instincts start to, in effect, try to pull him back on course. Now, this time he thinks clearly that he can't throw his brain or his conscious mind away. He has to persevere with his search for knowledge. That's the only way he's going to find the knowledge that he'll need to become a master of this conscious, self-adjusting brain that he's got. So this time he decides, no, I'm going to defy my instincts and persevere with my search for knowledge and head down towards the island. So we see him heading towards the island this time. He doesn't acquiesce to his instincts. Now, his instincts, therefore, are going to, in effect, criticise him more and more. And, I mean, our instincts can tell our conscious mind when we need food or a drink of water, and we can consciously override that if we choose. So our instincts can in effect influence our behaviour, and then our conscious mind has the power to sort of either defy that or go along with it. Now, so Adam Stork is decided that he's going to have to live with the criticism from his instinctive self because he has to keep searching for knowledge. I mean, ideally at that moment, he would sit out on a limb, as it were, with his instinctive self and have a little talk and say, listen, you might be perfectly instinctively orientated to where we should and shouldn't fly, but you don't understand why we should fly or not fly in such and such a direction. I'm now using my conscious mind, which is an understanding system. So I need to understand why we should fly this way and not that way, and I need knowledge. And so by all means tell me when I'm off course, but don't criticise me for your gene-based learning system. You've acquired your orientations through natural selection. I'm a conscious nerve-based learning system, and I can understand cause and effect. So we're different learning systems. Now that little explanation depended on him being able to know about nerves and genes and how the different ways they process information. That one's an insightful learning system and the other isn't. One's an understanding system. But there was no knowledge. I mean, he's in a catch-22. He needs the knowledge that he's setting out to find, specifically explanation of the difference in the way genes and nerves process information, that one's insightful and one's not, to defend himself, to explain why he needs to persevere with the search for knowledge. But he doesn't have any knowledge. He's in this catch-22. So what can old Adam Stork do? He's going to have to live with this criticism emanating from his instinctive self, and I've got a cartoon about that in my book. And you can see old Adam Stork flying off course here, and you can see his instinctive self with a small brain on the right in this little drawing. And we can see that Adam unavoidably can only do three things. He can't live all day, every day with this unfair criticism. which he can't refute because he can't explain why he needs to search for knowledge. So three things happen. He blocks out the criticism. He says, I don't deserve it. I can't explain why I don't deserve it, so I'm just going to block it out, live in denial. So he blocks out the criticism. The second thing is he becomes angry towards the criticism and says he needs to express some resentment if he's going to cope. We can't expect him not to. And thirdly, he's going to become egocentric. Now, ego in the dictionary means conscious thinking self. So Adam's conscious thinking self, or ego, is going to become centered or focused on trying to validate himself, to searching for a win in any situation, some form of relief from the criticism he's having to live with, the unfair criticism. So old Adam Stork has become alienated, and he's become angry, and he's become egocentric as unavoidable responses to this unfair criticism. And the only time that he can end this unavoidable blocking out and retaliation and need for some sort of win out of life, incessant search for reinforcement, is to finally be able to explain himself. As I said, if he'd been able to explain himself on day one of this upset state, he would never have got upset. And clearly, when he can explain his upset, all the upsets can subside. So Adam's become angry, egocentric, and alienated as an unavoidable result of having to search for knowledge. Now, if we sit back and think about that, you remember in the story in Genesis, Adam and Eve take the fruit from the tree of knowledge. They become upset humans. They become, evil was the old word for it, and are banished. But this story says that no, they had to. They couldn't avoid. They had to have some way of relieving themselves from the unfair criticism of becoming conscious beings. So this is a defence of Adam Stork. Adam Stork, in fact, is a hero because he, at any time, he could acquiesce and give in to his instincts and fly back on course, but then he would never find knowledge. He has to have the courage to search for knowledge and suffer, becoming angry, egocentric, and alienated. Is that marvellous musical? It says we had to march into hell for a heavenly cause. Which has got the full paradox of the human situation. We had to march into hell. We had to suffer becoming upset, that is becoming angry, egocentric, and alienated, for a heavenly cause of finding knowledge. So imbued in that description, to march into hell for a heavenly cause, is the whole dilemma and paradox of the human condition. And so this story, that we became conscious, and as a result of that we couldn't avoid, we had to try to restrain it as much as we could, but there was a good reason for our badness, if you like. This is a dignifying, redeeming, transforming understanding of why we became upset. So I've replaced the word evil and all those condemning terms with the term upset, because it is a state of upset. We became psychologic. Psych in the dictionary means soul, or so our psyche or instinctive self became insecure, needing for reinforcement all the time, and our conscious mind became insecure, needing reinforcement, and it unavoidably repressed our soul, our instinctive self. So we became psychotic and neurotic. Our mind needed constantly to find ways to defend itself. It became neuron means nerves, so our mind became focused on defensiveness, on denial, on ways to escape criticism. We became neurotic, and we buried our instinctive self, our soul, and so we became psychotic and neurotic. So we became psychologically upset. So this is an explanation of our corrupted human condition, our in the biblical terms, our fall from grace, if you like. It explains that Adam was actually a hero and not a villain, and that he had to have the courage to defy his instincts and persevere with the search for knowledge. So this is a dignifying, redeeming, ameliorating, healing understanding of our psychological upset state. And clearly, now that we can understand this, all the upset can subside because we have the source of it. We can finally understand where this all began, and we're all sufferers of this human condition. And since this conscious mind emerged some 2 million years ago, it's been increasing ever since. We became conscious, we started to challenge our instincts, this clash between the instinct and intellect that developed, and we went on this horrendous journey away from ourselves. We had to lose ourselves to find ourselves. So now that we've found ourselves, found understanding of the good reason for our badness, all that upset, or what used to be called badness or evil, can now subside. So that's the macro presentation in my book. This in chapter 2, the dignifying explanation of. And there's a lot of more subtlety to it. I mean, what was our instinctive orientation? Obviously, we're not storks. We're not orientated some flight path. And in chapter 4 and 5 of my book, I reveal that nurturing is what made us human. That we acquired an orientation to being cooperative, loving, and selfless. And that was acquired through nurturing, and I look at in chapter 3. I look at the anthropological evidence that shows that our ancestors were very like our distant ape ancestors some 5 million years ago, where bonobos are like at the moment. And bonobos I explain in chapter 3 in chapter 4 and 5. Are nurturing their infants, they're matriarchal, and they're bringing the competitive animal condition where animals compete for territory under control. So they're a sort of a living example of how we acquired our which has been one of the great mysteries, the greatest mystery in biology and in science as a whole has been the issue of the human condition, which my book addresses in chapter 2. There are other huge mysteries, and one of the other huge mysteries has been how humans acquired their altruistic, selfless, loving, moral nature, which the voice of which is our conscience. So biology's, nearly every science journal you pick up will have another theory about how we acquired our moral nature. But in chapter 4 and 5, you'll see that the explanation of how we acquired it was through nurturing, through the loving of our infants. And in fact, that idea was first put forward by a fellow called John Fiske. You can read about it in chapter 5 of my book, in only 4 years after Darwin put forward his idea of natural selection. And it was described at the time as a theory far more important than Darwin's idea of natural selection. Now, you have to ask if John Fiske's nurturing explanation for our moral nature was described as far more important than Darwin's idea of natural selection, and was presented way back there 4 years after Darwin's presented his book, The Origin of Species, why haven't we been taught that at school? And why are there all these theories ever since that to try to explain our altruistic moral nature that don't attribute it to nurturing? So now we're getting close to talking about David's issue about autism, blaming it on genes, genetic defect rather than on bad parenting, or inadequate parenting, because it actually isn't actually bad, as I'll now go on to explain. So we originally described how Plato, the centerpiece of all Plato's writing was this idea of an allegory of humans having to live hiding underground because they can't face the truth of the human condition, and so we've had to live in denial of the human condition. So we've had all these sort of fake excuses that got us by until we found the real one, and such fake excuses is to blame it on that we have animal instincts that compete for territory, when clearly we suffer from a psychological human condition, not a genetic opportunism animal condition. So that's clearly not the real reason. So humans have this huge insecurity that underlies all our behaviour. This insecurity about why we've been the way we've been. Why haven't we been ideal? Why did we fall from grace? If the Garden of Eden for humans, as our instinctive orientation was to being loving and cooperative, and that was acquired through nurturing, why did we fall from grace? Why did we fall out of that Edenic, Eden, cooperative, gentle, loving place that the bonobos are living evidence of how it was acquired and so forth? Why did we fall from grace? Until we could explain that, we had to live underground in Plato's cave of denial, because we couldn't explain the good reason for our badness, if you like. And until we could, we had to use all these fake excuses, such as blaming it on the animal condition when it's clearly the psychological human condition. We had all these fake excuses. We lived in denial. We lived deep underground in Plato's cave of denial, of hideout, where we could only see distorted images created on the wall of the cave, as Plato described it, by the flickering flames of the fire, which is a representation of the sun blocking our exit from the cave. So we've had a distorted view of the world, such as, and one of those key distortions was obviously blaming it on genes and blaming it on having aggressive territorial animal instincts, when again we suffer from psychological human condition. So living in denial has been incredibly important to our survival, and since I'm suggesting that we became the human condition, this psychologically upset state emerged from this clash with our original instinctive self some 2 million years ago. That's a lot of anger, egocentricity and alienation that's accumulated in those 2 million years. We are deeply, deeply psychotic and neurotic, deeply repressing that instinctive child within us, collective unconscious, however we like to refer to it, this magic, cooperative, loving, instinctive state that we lived in, and that's our instinctive heritage and orientation, and suddenly we've become angry, egocentric and alienated. It was a very diabolically awful situation. We set out in search of knowledge. We unavoidably tried to block out the criticism from our instincts and unavoidably retaliated, became angry, and unavoidably became egocentric, focused on trying to validate ourselves. And these are all divisive traits. So our behaviour, once we started to respond to that criticism, was fueled by our instincts wanting us to be the opposite. So old Adam Stork, who was just criticised for deviating from a flight path, didn't suffer from a double whammy like we did. He just becomes angry, egocentric and alienated, but that behaviour is not at odds with his instinctive orientation, which is just to a flight path. But in our case, it was a terrible situation, because we start to unavoidably, some 2 million years ago, start to become retaliatory and defensive and desperate for reinforcement, extremely insecure about our worth. And so these responses were further at odds with our instinctive orientation and produced even more criticism from so that really upset us. I mean, imagine just living with this unfair criticism for one day. I mean, imagine Adam Stork, to use that very simple analogy. He flies off course, he defies his instincts, he unavoidably starts to block the criticism from his instincts. He tries to to prove it's not deserved. He becomes insecure and defensive and retaliatory, and this produces even more criticism from our instinctive, all-loving, cooperative, gentle soul, bonobo-like soul, so after only a few hours of doing that, he's begun to become very, very frustrated and deeply upset. And after a few days of living with that, imagine if your whole village said, look, no one is to plant roses or something, and then you go and plant roses, but you can't explain why you got to plant them or something like this, or plant weeds or something, I don't know. And you can't explain why you're doing it. So this is in violation of the whole village's agreed strategy. And you can't explain what you're going to do, why you're doing this. So as far as the whole village is concerned, you're one bad dude. But you're actually not, but you can't explain why you're not. So you're going to have to live with that. I mean, they're going to be putting dead cats in your letterbox after the first week, and they're going to be turning their back to you when you go to the shops. It's going to be awful. And you know, and yeah, in our case, you know, our instinctive orientation was through this long nurturing period that the bonobo's in the midst of, developing this cooperative, loving state, so our instincts are to be loving and cooperative, and we come into the world expecting it to be like that still, because we've only been living in this psychologically upset state since the conscious mind fully developed some 2 million years ago, and only really intensely in the last 10,000 years since agriculture and domestication of animals allowed humans to live one on top of the other, which sort of greatly magnifies the frustrations arising from this upset state of the human condition. So, yeah, we come into the world expecting it to be still loving and cooperative and gentle, and it's nothing like that. So, of course, humans coming into the world now are still innocent. And don't forget, adults can't explain this to children, why the world isn't perfect. Because unable to defend our upset state, we can't even afford to admit we are upset. So we live in deep denial, deep in Plato's cave under the ground, unable to face any truth about ourselves, deeply psychotic, soul repressed, and deeply neurotic, committed to living in denial. And I mean, little babies come into the world, they can see all this. I mean, as adults, we become alienated and we can't see our alienation. I mean, you can't be blocking something out and be aware that you're blocking it out, otherwise you haven't blocked it out. So we come into the world expecting it to be ideal, and it isn't. And no one will even admit that it isn't or talk about it. So there's this huge denial, this world of falseness. And so, of course, we die a million deaths almost. I mean, Samuel Beckett wrote that this is how brief our soul's life is. He described it: we are born astride a grave. The light gleams an instant, then it's night once more. So we are born astride a grave. So there's a grave, hole in the ground, and we're born astride the grave. So we're born there, the baby drops down, and just for an instant before it disappears into the hole, there's a little bit of light comes in, and that's all the light, that's all we experience of happiness and an ideal state. We are born astride a grave. The light leaves an instant, and then it's night once more. It's that brief. And that's understandable. I mean, again, 2 million years of living unjustly condemned and never able to redeem ourselves, explain why it was unjust, is a horrific amount of upset in us. Sure, we've learned to civilise. I mean, when we say civilise, it means we're restraining. It doesn't mean we've got rid of it, eliminated it. It just means that we've learned to sort of bottle it up, contain it. So we've learned to civilise. But underneath that, I mean, there's this volcanic anger, and it comes out in wars and sex and all these situations. And so, yeah, there's volcanic distress inside of humans. And all the restraint and other devices like religion, where we've tried to transcend that state and defer to some idyllic state, have only served to hide that psychosis, and it's not going to get us anywhere. We can't. All those devices for managing our upset don't get rid of the upset, and that's why there's no possibility of fixing all the trauma in the world until such time as this deeper understanding was found. Because patching it up, putting band-aids on it, trying to manage it with better forms of restraint or better laws or better self-discipline or going to gurus that teach us to transcend and love ourselves, whatever, they're all artificial solutions. Ultimately, we needed the understanding of our psychosis, the source of all this pain. to finally start unpacking it and dismantling it and loving ourselves. We needed brain food, not brain anesthetic. We need to dignify ourselves. We need to be able to understand the pain in the brain. We needed relief from. We needed the great burden of guilt to be lifted off the shoulders of the human race, and this does it. So that's why Professor Prosen has said, this is the book that saves the world, because it brings love to that core issue. As Sir Lawrence van der Post, the most influential, most quoted author in my books, once said, true love is love of the difficult and unlovable. We needed to, as the Rolling Stones song says, we needed to have sympathy for the devil, that's right. And William Blake, so the marriage of heaven and hell, that was the great destiny of the human race, to one day find the redeeming, reconciling of these two parts of ourselves, this darker part. Like Carl Jung was forever, the psychoanalyst, was forever saying, wholeness for humans depends on the ability to own our own shadow, to love the dark side of ourselves, to make sense of it. So this explains and gives us the fundamental ability to love the dark side of ourselves, and only that will, as Jung said, make us whole. Trying to find better forms of managing our upset is no real long-term solution, and the human race is entering endgame where the human body can't endure any more psychosis and neurosis. We're in endgame here. This is a Time magazine article, recent Time magazine article, about the me generation, it says. And in it, it summarises the incidence of narcissistic personality disorder, which plagues this current generation, is what this article is about. The incidence of narcissistic personality disorder is nearly 3 times as high for people in their 20s as for the generation that's now 65 or older. And it goes on to say millennials, this is the current generation, are 80 million strong, the biggest age group in American history. And then it goes on to explain that the problem is that people trying to boost their self-esteem, this narcissism, is at base due to lack of self-esteem. So it's saying that the 80 million strong, biggest age group in American history is a narcissistic me generation, because it's fundamentally extremely insecure. It lacks self-esteem, ability to love itself, love themselves. So people now, current generations, are entering this end play state where they just can't bear any more criticism, and they desperately want to become reinforced. So their hunger, their narcissistic, self-worth obsessed. And if we just think about old Adam Stork 2 million years ago, flying off course, getting criticised unfairly, and then we extrapolate that for some 2 million years to get to where we are today, then by jingo, we would be as incredibly insecure now. The more Adam Stork searches for knowledge, the more angry, egocentric and alienated he becomes, the more the next generation has to grow up with this parents that are angry, egocentric and alienated, nothing like they originally instinctively were like, cooperatively and lovingly behaved. So they die a million deaths, and they grow up, and then the next generation suffers even more, and they adopt more denial and more need for reinforcement and more anger and so on and so on, and it just escalates, and so that's why we're entering this end play state where the world can't bear any more. Human body can't endure any more psychosis and neurosis, and our earth can't cope with any more effects of that angry, egocentric, where everyone's trying to rip off the environment for much wealth as they can get, and build bigger houses and have bigger cars and win more competitions. And I mean, it's down to a situation now where humans basically just live for the next win. I mean, it's just one sports match to the next, and between that there's really nothing in their lives that of meaning to them. They just live for the next win they can hope to get. I mean, I've just done a quick trip around from to America and then to the UK. I didn't get to see you, David, but hopefully I'll get, because I had to stay in London, but hopefully I'll get to see you when I go again shortly. But I couldn't go up to Cambridge. But anyway, when I came back on this trip, just to give you an illustration of this end play state the world's in and how desperate it needs these understandings that ameliorate, bring love to us, to the dark side of ourselves, make us whole. I was talking to someone in London, and he described how at sports events now, people are so angry and virulent that they boo and clap and shout out in those traditional moments of silence, like when honouring the death of a club champion or the loss of servicemen defending the country, or even when the national anthem is played. I mean, that's amazing. And I saw on TV on the plane coming back, a story about how there are modelling agencies now that specialise in supplying men and women who are particularly ugly looking, because advertisers now want to use them, as the public now find beauty too confronting, too condemning, and of their own sort of messed up, stressed out lives, which is just astonishing. And a recent article in the Atlantic reported that even political correctness is not evasive enough of reality for people. There's a new trend called empathetic correctness. Listen to this, where students at universities are refusing to read texts that challenge their own personal comfort. Some campuses are even proposing to so-called trigger warnings to be placed on material that might trigger discomfort for students, so that students can read only portions of the book with which they are fully comfortable. And the article goes on to quote George Orwell's dire prediction of a society which banned books. People can't cope with any truth now, any self-confrontation. They're incredibly insecure. They just want this me generation. This is 80 million strong, biggest generation in American history, that are now all narcissistic, now desperate for reinforcement. So I mean, Harry, Professor Prosen received an initial response to my book from an American psychotherapist who wrote to Harry about the growing number of clients he receives that report a sense of despair and apprehension, not just about their own lives, but about the future of our species. And Harry responded saying, I absolutely agree with your comments about anxiety over the state of the world. Of the world now vibrating through everyone, including myself. Then he said, the world is craving some real honesty and bravery, and thank goodness this book delivers that. I mean, there's all the anger and social disintegration in the Muslim world, and the rest of the world's not far behind. It's just disintegrating everywhere, because old Adam Stalker's got to this state where he's so embittered, and the generation after generation have suffered even more distress in their upbringing and unavoidably, and it's got to this terminal. So my book is titled, Is It to Be Terminal Alienation or Transformation for the human race? Because that's the balance. That's the equation we're in. We either find the transformative understanding of the human condition, which finally dignifies humans and brings relief at the psychological fundamental level, or we face terminal alienation, where it's in a psychotic state where, like, it's what's happening, where students don't even read books and won't read anything that's at all critical. And boo, and they're so angry that they just boo in the silences and clap their hands and shout out. It's all disintegrating because we have to find... Sorry, Dave?
I've been very impressed in recent months, years, with all at sports occasions, how dignified people have been during the 1 minute silence. 2-minute silence. I have been pleasantly surprised that at the behaviour.
Well, I don't know what that person was referring to, but that's what I was told. I don't know, David, what your.
I mean, I watch a lot of sport.
Yeah.
I have been pleasantly surprised at behaviour. I agree of the frustration and the selfishness and everything of people, but they have rallied to behave sensibly on those occasions.
Well, that's good news. Well, I don't know what experiences that have occurred in England that prompted that comment to me, but it was made to. It was made to me. I imagine were we to Google it, we would find where it's been described. I haven't read it in the literature. I was just told about it, and it doesn't surprise me. I mean, you would think that people would be very reverent and respectful in those situations. But
we've had a lot with the football disaster, the new repeat of the investigation where 90 people died at Liverpool match, and then we've had the 30 club chairmen died, people die. We've had 4 situations where they had to remember the distinction, and I've been pleasantly surprised that the good behaviour. There have been more minor exceptions, I agree. But anyway, it's a pretty trivial part of the story.
Yeah, I do think that the overall fragility of the world at the moment is pretty well apparent to everybody, and I think what that
we've also discussed the use of the term race, and I've sort of suddenly realised now you have it on the front page where you're really talking about the human species.
Yeah, but it's just a colloquialism. It's just the phrase that everyone uses, human race. But I agree. David's pointing out that where I've used race in the book, I should put inverted commas around it, and I have made that change since David pointed out to me that and I've clarified that by race I mean a group of people that have spent a long time together and are genetically closely related, and so I've made that clarification. Yeah, but
as a biologist, I'm aware. I've been trained to recognise a race as a very distinctive division of a species, and there are 5 races that are species that can be recognised, and that related using the term race for cultures, for religious groups, and everything is false.
Is what?
It's false. It's wrong.
False. Yeah. Well.
Yeah.
But if a group of people do spend a long time together, and go through similar experience together, those experience will be reflected in general in their as a group, in them as a group. I mean, that's
sure. Yeah, I agree totally. And they're a group. They're an ethnic group. They're a religious group.
Yeah.
Whatever. They're not a race.
Yeah. No, I accept that, and I've got that clarification in the book. When this is only an advanced copy, and I've made that clarification in there now, David. The term, how I use the term race, is now qualified in there, and it's wherever it's mentioned, it's got inverted commas around it.
But we've still got the front page, I suddenly realised.
Oh, yeah, but I suppose it should be human species, but human race is I think people would accept that as just a colloquial, is a term that everyone uses, and so it's
dangerous.
Sorry?
As you say, it's colloquial and it's dangerous.
Well, it is.
You do want to be rigid, clear, concise in your presentation.
Yeah, well, we could replace it with species, but we should replace it with species in that sense. But I think you could argue, David, that human race is a race in the true sense, that the whole of the human species at the moment is a race. I mean, in your definition of what a race is, you said there are 6 varieties. There are 6 specific races.
5 races.
Sorry?
There's 5 races.
Sorry, 5 races. but
Yeah.
as a collective whole, they are another. They're a race. They're a distinct entity, and I think so. You can talk about the human race as a whole being a race. I think that's not incorrect.
Well, I can't, because you have the terms for the hierarchy of division. You have species, you have subspecies, so on.
Yeah, well, but race is used.
So to call a species a race, for me, is wrong.
Well, yeah, okay. I think technically you're right. It is wrong, but I think as a description, as a way of referring, like the human is as a group, as a collective group, an identifiable, separatable group of organisms, then I think that the word race in that sense is legitimate. But I understand what you're saying, and I've made those.
You're trying to use it at different levels, the same term. But, you know, a group of Bushmen or a society, a particular national country, and so you build it up in different religious groups, and you know, to use race in such a variable way loses the rigour that I thought you were aspiring to.
Yeah, well, I said I've made that change through the book. I put in ethnic group in a lot of ethnic group, and I put quotes around it, and I've clarified what is meant by it in this in the context of.
Sure, yeah.
I did all those things you asked.
Sure, I appreciate that, but then I suddenly noticed.
Yeah, on the front cover
page. I hadn't realised that before.
Okay.
I think it undermines, it weakens your argument.
No, it wants to be. It wants
such a variable way.
Yeah. No, it wants to be. It wants to be rigorous. I mean, where I'm going out into this whole forbidden realm of the human condition, it's so open to. It's so upsetting of people to have all this dug up and revealed, pulled out of the cave, as Plato said. When they're dragged out of the cave, they're going to much resist. So we want to be as rigorous and as free of flaws as we can possibly be. And I've tried to do that with the book. It's very comprehensive. It does present all the different biological arguments for everything, and gives them airtime and describes them and tries to deal with them all. So I try to be as fair and as comprehensive as I can be. And I have gone back and made that clarification in there. Okay, but just to... to bring this round to there are lots of heresies in Is It To Be, because again we've got to remember the fundamental situation. We've had to live in this cave of denial with all these contrived excuses, because we had to have some excuse to cope, and so we blamed it on being aggressive and competitive because of competing for territory and so forth. When we have a cooperative, loving history, and so on, and so we've got all these different false excuses or contrived excuses that we've had to employ. We had to have some way of defending ourselves. Old Adam Stork has to block out that criticism somehow. He can't live with it, live in that state undefended. So. So we needed all these devices, and now they suddenly exposed as being false and superficial and artificial, and that exposure brings about a future shock, sort of metaphorically referred to as Judgment Day, when we suddenly all our dishonesties and artificialities and superficialities and above all our alienation is exposed. I mean, R.D. Lang spoke about, he was so honest it wasn't funny, and he spoke of our alienation goes to the roots. This is how, after 2 million years of living in denial, how deeply psychotic and neurotic we are, alienated from our true self or soul. Our alienation goes to the roots. The realisation of this is the essential springboard for any serious reflection on any aspect of present in the human life. And he's saying we need to acknowledge that they're psychotic in order to to make any real progress. And that's what I'm criticising, these biological excuses that have been used, such as we compete for territory as to being the reason. We're not admitting this alienated psychotic state. They were living in denial of that. So then he goes on. The ordinary person is a shriveled, desiccated fragment of what a person can be. The condition of alienation, of being asleep, of being unconscious, of being out of one's mind, is the condition of the normal man. Between us and it, our true self or soul, there's a veil which is more like 50 foot of solid concrete. The outer, divorced from any illumination from the inner, is a state of darkness. So we're living in a state of darkness, which equates perfectly with Plato's living in this blocked out, hidden cave state. We are in an age of darkness. The state of outer darkness is a state of sin, alienation, or estrangement from the inner light. We block out this inner light, this soulful, truthful, condemning part of ourselves. We are bemused and crazed creatures, strangers to ourselves, to one another. We are dead but think we are alive. We are asleep but think we are awake. And it goes on in that we are doubly unconscious. We are so ill we no longer feel ill, as in terminal illness. We are mad but have no insight into the fact of our madness. We are so out of touch with this realm, which is where the issue of the human condition lies, that many people argue that it doesn't exist. I mean, my book begins... which people find distressing. It begins, or very unusual. My book begins by talking about this process of resignation, where people, when they're 14 or 12, they actually start trying to think about the human condition, try to face it down. So let's imagine Adam Stork's. We're looking at Adam Stork's generation 20 generations down the track. So by this stage, Adam Stork and his progeny now are very, very upset, very angry, egocentric and alienated, and they can't admit that they are because they can't explain it, so they can't afford to admit it. And so they have some children, and those children suddenly encounter these adults that are not admitting that they're living in this weird, alienated state that R.D. Laing so honestly described. And so from the child's point of view, they're looking around at the world and it's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. I mean, R.D. Laing said, insanity is a perfectly rational adjustment to an insane world. A perfectly rational adjustment to an insane world. That's true. Our world is insane to our soul, our instinctive self. There's a veil of 50 foot of concrete between us and our soul, our true self. So the child... starts looking around and starts thinking, God, this is really crazy. Everyone's mad. Everyone's insane. And no one's admitting it. They're smiling and buying a new pair of blue shoes and going and laughing and carrying on and keeping up with brave. But, the child can see through that and it's trying to understand it. So this child around 12 years old, they actually start trying to wrestle with this issue of the human condition. And no one's talking about it or admitting it. And adults are just fake and artificial and escapist and defensive and dishonest. But the child can see through that. So the young adolescent starts to wrestle with the human condition. But by about 14, they actually start encountering the human condition within themselves, the imperfections, the angers and insensitivities and lack of concern for others. And it's when they encounter the human condition within themselves, that becomes unbearable. So they reach a point at about 15 or 14 when they go into a state of deepest, darkest depression. And what they discover is they just cannot afford to keep looking at the human condition. They've got to block it out. So they resign themselves to blocking out the issue of the human condition at that moment, from that moment onwards.
Yeah, so I need a break.
Yeah, no, don't worry, David.
I'm beginning to fade anyway. I'll come back in a second. Yeah, it's quite a good place to finish. It's going back to this situation of, it's something that just jarred a bit, that we raised at the beginning, because I haven't felt that you've clarified, justified the fact that autism has not got a genetic basis, because the I think all parents genuinely want to be good parents and make good effort. And there are some who are particularly good, and yet with an autistic child, they can make no progress.
Yep. Yep, I think that's a very good question, and to deal now directly with that question, I mean, Winnicott in here, if you search Winnicott, there's no index at the back of this book because the book's online, so you can search it easily online by just dialing it up and putting the search. If you search Winnicott, he describes it is what he says that this is 773. This is British Psychological Society. The former president of the British Psychological Society, the psychiatrist and paediatrician W.D. Winnicott. This is in paragraph 773. He wrote that a proportion of cases where autism is eventually diagnosed, there has been injury or some degenerative process affecting the child's brain. However, in the majority of cases, the illness is a disturbance of emotional development. Autism is not a disease. I might be asked what did I call these cases before the word autism turned up. The answer is infant or childhood schizophrenia. There are certain difficulties that arise when primitive things are being experienced by the baby that depend not only on inherited personal tendencies, but also on what happens to be provided by the mother. Her failure spells disaster of a particular kind for a baby. At the beginning, the baby needs the mother's full attention and usually gets precisely this. And in this period, the basis of mental health is laid down. The essential feature for baby's development is the mother's capacity to adapt to the infant's needs through her healthy ability to identify with the baby. With such a capacity, she can, for instance, hold her baby, and without it, she cannot hold her baby, except in a way that disturbs the baby's personal living process. It seems necessary to add that this concept of the mother's unconscious, repressed hate of the child is the quality of early care that counts. It is this aspect of environmental provision that rates highest in general review of disorders in the development of a child, of which autism is one. Autism is a highly sophisticated defence organisation. What we see is invulnerability. The child carries around the lost memory of unthinkable anxiety, and the illness is a complex mental structure ensuring against recurrence of the conditions of unthinkable anxiety. So here's the former president of the British Psychoanalytical Society saying that autism is a highly sophisticated defence organisation. What we see is invulnerability. Now, what I'm trying to do is explain that. Explain that in this story of Adam Stork is after thousands of generations, of course, babies are going to come into the world and it's going to be hugely imperfect. Now, that doesn't mean at all that mothers aren't going to try their absolute heart out to try to be good mothers. And as I said, parents would rather admit to being an axe murderer than a bad father or mother. And for a lot of women, the only really important anchor in their lives is motherhood. If they fail in a primary role, they feel that should come naturally. It is devastating for them. That's in paragraph 367. So it's been an unbearable truth. But now, you see, this is the whole point. Now that we can explain this heroic journey, this immensely psychologically upsetting, but immensely heroic journey that the human race has been on to find knowledge in the face of unfair criticism, finally we can learn to love ourselves. We can understand that all parents are going to be massively angry, egocentric and alienated, sufferers of the human condition. And all children coming into the world are going to be massively, have to dissociate to some degree to cope. And the more extreme, they're going to have to completely dissociate. And that's what Winnicott's saying is occurring in autism. But again, that was that Winnicott and others like him who dared to say those things, that it's lack of love, were persecuted and hounded. As Winnicott said, expect, he said, Winnicott cautioned, expect resistance to the idea of cause that points to emotional development. There will be those who prefer to find physical, genetic, biochemical or endocrine causes, both for autism and for schizophrenia. He says expect that to happen, that people will blame it on genes and so forth, because it's an unbearable truth. But now it isn't an unbearable truth, but it's a future shock. And it's an example of the many future shocks in this book, such as about the differences in alienation between races. That's an unbearable truth on the face of it. And there's so many in this book. It's just full of heresies. In chapter 1, the extremely superficial non-answers about human behaviour that mechanistic science has been giving us is exposed. In chapter 2's explanation of the human condition exposes the dishonesty of pseudo-idealistic left wing, and politics is basically brought to an end. In chapter 3, demystification of God as integrative meaning makes religion, in a sense, redundant. Chapter 4 confronts humans with the historically unbearable truth that nurturing was the prime or main influence in the emergence of our species. We couldn't admit that nurturing played a role, was the key or prime mover in human development, let alone in our own lives. In chapter 7 confronts men and women with the truths of the real basis of their relationship, that women aren't mainframed to the battle of the human condition. And that chapter also confronts us with the truth of the difference in alienation between races. Overall, there's extreme state of alienation of the whole human race is exposed. So yeah, this is Truth Day, Honesty Day, Exposure Day, Transparency Day, the long-feared Judgment Day. This is going to run into this sort of reaction where people are going to find it unbearable to. But I'm trying to say that if we were to sit down with all the parents and all the children now and tell them this wonderful heroic story of the human race from ignorance to enlightenment, where they had to live without the defence for ourselves and they couldn't help but cope by blocking out criticism and so on, it's just the most heroic, wonderful, fabulous story, and they can all jump around and rejoice and hug each other even though they are all variously upset. We can now understand ourselves. Parents can know, of course we're not going to be able to, no matter how, all parents do try their absolute heart out to love their children. It's not their fault, it's the history of the human race's fault. They're part of this heroic journey, and inevitably at the end of a huge heroic battle that we've been involved in, all humans are butchered. They're all massively, as R.D. Laing talked about, psychotic and neurotic. We're all... we are bemused and crazed creatures, strangers to our true selves and to one another. We are dead but think we are alive. We are asleep but think we are awake, and goes on. Of course new generations encountering that. It's not parents. I agree absolutely, David, that parents do try their heart out to be loving of their offspring. But it's just, once now we can explain, we're not even be able to admit that we're alienated. So we haven't been able to realise how shocking that is, to how upset state is to new generations. That's why I begin the book with resignation, because that reconnects adults with the truth of just how horrific and how afraid we've been of the issue of the human condition. And with that in tow, with that understanding, we can now go and unpack everything, because everything, when you bore down into it, all is based on these denials, these false accounts of ourselves. But now we can understand why we had to be so dishonest. We had to employ all these excuses. So the whole of chapter 1 demolishes all the dishonest biological explanations that have been put forward for human behaviour. And it's easy to do because I've established that we're living in denial, and we need to avoid these truths. So we had to adopt the truth that we are, selfish because of our animal heritage, which is rubbish. We're not competitive and aggressive because of competing for territory. That's rubbish. Our heritage has been cooperative, loving. We had a soulful, natural, instinctive, cooperative heritage, and then we took the fruit from the tree of knowledge, became conscious. We lived in this innocent Garden of Eden state, took the fruit from the tree of knowledge, the shit hit the fan. Then we became massively upset. And of course new generations can't be expected to, and no mother can be expected to be able to children come in and they can see through, they're not alienated yet, they can see through all our disguise. So we have these artificial smiles and all these bright lights and all this artificial, the world is saturated with dishonesty. As Beckett said, we are born astride a grave. The light gleams an instant, then it's night once more. That's how brief our soul lives before it it disintegrates. As Lang said, you know, there's 50 foot of solid concrete between us and our soul.
Maybe I need to go and reflect on this.
Yeah, no worries, David. Yeah. But anyway, David, thank you very, very much for helping and for participating in this discussion. I think it'll help a lot of people, because a lot of people, well, everyone, without exception, really, will be thinking have the same sort of defense reaction as you're having, and will need the same reassurance and explanation, and they'll have the same end result where you just said, where I need to reflect on this, I need to think about this. And so that'll help a lot of people, David, and I'm very, very grateful and appreciative of your time and your participation.
Well, it's been fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David. And I look forward to catching up with you in England very shortly.
Yeah, great.
Thanks, David. Good night.
Okay.
Good night, your time.
Bye.
Bye.